One of my favorite recent movies was Spider-Man No Way Home. It's the third one of these most recent Spider-Man movies, but what made it so enjoyable for me was, if you haven't seen the movie, the storyline's all about Spider-Man's interacting with the multiverse, these other parallel universes that are sort of like our universe, but sort of different. And this is just basically a story excuse for them to bring back actors who've played Spider-Man in the past. Guys like Tobey Maguire, that was the Spider-Man who was the first one I ever saw in the movies. He's able to come back, and now all the actors that you've seen over the last 15, 20 years, however long they've been making these movies, play Spider-Man, are able to all interact together. It's great. It's very nostalgic. It's just a fun movie. And I love this idea of the multiverse. I've seen this used a lot in different sci-fi stories, different fantasy stories. This idea that there's parallel universes, sort of like ours, but sort of different. What I didn't realize, probably until I was in high school or so, was that this is actually a theory that some people really believe about reality, that there may really be a multiverse where our universe is not the only thing that exists, but a innumerable amount, maybe even infinite amount of universes might exist outside of ours that would be maybe very similar, maybe very different. Well, the reason I first heard of this, and the reason it comes up a lot in apologetic conversations, is that the multiverse will be appealed to defeat some theistic arguments, some arguments for God. Christians will they'll make a lot of arguments for God, but two of the ones that they'll make is the idea that, number one, that the universe began. They'll say if the universe began, it didn't always exist, then there must have been some cause, and that the best explanation is a very powerful being that caused the universe. Things like the Big Bang in science will be pointed to say, look, it doesn't look like the universe always existed, but rather that time, space, and matter all began at some fixed point in the past. So how do we explain that? And Christians will say that, and I believe this is true, that the best explanation for that is that God exists. Another argument Christians will make is from the appearance of design, specifically of fine-tuning. Fine-tuning is this idea that there's a number of scientific constants, like the force of gravity, that don't necessarily have to be the way they are, but they, for whatever reason, are set just so. And because there's all these forces that are acting on the universe is able to begin and expand, and planets are able to form, and life is able to arise on Earth because we're just set up just right. We're just the right distance from the sun. We have just the right conditions here on Earth. And so it seems as though the universe was made just right so that human life could come to exist. And if any of these constants were just a little bit different, human life would never exist. Maybe the universe would not be able to sustain itself. So Christians will say that the best explanation for why the universe is so finely tuned, so perfectly made for life, is because a powerful being intended it for that way. Now, the multiverse, I've heard atheists or non-Christians appeal to the multiverse to defeat these two claims. They'll say the multiverse explains both why the universe began and why it's finely tuned. The argument will be that the multiverse in some way can create new universes. We might not understand exactly how it is. I remember the first time I heard about it, it was this idea that, maybe there's these parallel universes that exist like a membrane, and if they touch each other or interact in some way, a new universe could be created. I haven't heard that theory in a while. Maybe it's still out there. I've recently heard that we could think about the universe, the multiverse, in terms of like a liquid where the bubbles in the liquid are each pocket universe, and we're just one of those bubbles. And we could kind of think about it this way. Maybe the bubbles could interact, or the liquid itself generates new bubbles somehow. And so that the beginning, yes, the universe, our universe, did have a beginning, but it's not because there's a personal God. It's because there's a multiverse, and the multiverse generates new universes. The other reason they'll say is that, the fine-tuning, it does look like our universe is just perfectly made for human life. And what's the chances that would happen just totally by chance? Well, the chances increase if there's a innumerable, or especially if there's an infinite amount of other universes out there. Then we are one universe that just happened to be just right for human life, and many other universes exist where maybe there's no life, or life is so different, or whatever the case would be. And so if there is a multiverse, the argument from the beginning of the universe and from fine-tuning do not work, and so therefore God is not necessary. Now, I think the temptation would be, if we're first hearing this and we're a Christian, to say, if you're saying that there is no God because there's a multiverse, I want to attack the idea that there is a multiverse. I mean, after all, I only see one universe. What's the evidence that there's a multiverse. But I actually don't think we have to attack the idea of a multiverse. I think if we look at the claims of the multiverse, both arguments, the beginning and fine-tuning, still stand, although we might not realize it at first. Let's look at fine-tuning to begin with. We say that the fine-tuning in our universe is seen in the fact that everything is set up just perfectly that life can exist. And the chances would be, just by chance alone, it would seem like it was not necessary that it would be so perfectly attuned for our life. Well, the multiverse might actually have something similar going on. The multiverse, for some reason, if a multiverse exists, is able to generate new universes. But in order to create universes, think about how powerful that would be. I mean, our entire universe is just one small universe amongst many that this multiverse has created. The multiverse itself would seem to need to be finely tuned or created with a purpose to create universes. So while the multiverse might explain why our universe is finely tuned for human life, there might still be a problem of why is the multiverse itself appear to be finely tuned to create universes which would ultimately create human life. It almost just pushes the argument back one step. So it doesn't truly defeat the idea that there'd be fine tuning or purpose in reality. I also don't think it takes away the idea of a beginning. A multiverse could explain maybe why our universe began, but the multiverse itself would necessarily need to have begun. And that's because we don't only argue that the universe began on scientific grounds, that there's a Big Bang. We also argue it on philosophical grounds. This is an idea we could look at called infinite regression. This is the idea that an infinite amount of things could not have already occurred in the past. We might have a potentially infinite future. In the future, there might be an infinite amount of things to come. But right now, at any given moment, we have a finite amount of events that have occurred. This is because if there is an infinite amount of things in the past, then there's no beginning. Well, if there's no beginning, it's very difficult to understand how we could have crossed all the events to today from infinitely in the past. It would be like somebody trying to run a race, and the finish line is today, and the starting blocks is the beginning of time. If the past goes back infinitely, it would be like every time the guy is about to get off the starting blocks because the starter pistol went off, they say, hey, let's stop. Let's just move those starting blocks back 1 foot. And then right as they're about to start the race, we move it back again. If we move it back infinitely, there's no way that runner is ever going to get to the finish line. Just like if there's an infinite amount of things in the past events, we could never get to today. So if a multiverse existed that at some point created our universe, well, then it itself could not have infinitely existed. It itself must have a beginning, and then we need to explain it. What kind of thing could create a multiverse? I think the best explanation would be an extremely powerful personal being. So if you come across this idea of a multiverse, I don't think we need to feel threatened by this idea. I think even if a multiverse exists, it's very hypothetical at this point, but even if it did, it would be only more evidence for the existence of God.